I can do that. Mr. Dunning?
Present.
I don't see Ms. Cohn yet. Mr. Bowman? Gary, we can't hear you. Yes. Okay, Mr. Zion or Mr. Spurgeon?
Present.
Mr. Ward?
Here.
Ms. Harston?
Present.
And Chair Costello?
Present.
And Mr. Power is Executive Director.
Present.
Thank you.
Do
Yes.
we, it looks like we have a few new members. Should we do some quick introductions? Do we, or I guess my first question, I guess before that is, do we have anybody here from the public for the public forum?
We do not.
We do not. Okay. Do we have a few new members? I think we do, right? Okay.
I believe the only new member that's present on this call would be Beth.
Okay.
Everybody else, I
Beth.
think, had at least one meeting.
Okay, great. Well, nice to meet you. Welcome aboard.
Nice to meet you.
We'll jump in here. I guess.
Was I right? Because I thought I had
Yes.
everybody else accounted for.
Yeah, I'm just
Okay,
trying to
great.
navigate Zoom and scroll
Yep.
through here. I think you are correct.
Okay.
All right, well, let's move into new business. I guess first thing would be the election of officers, chair and vice chair.
I think we need to approve minutes first.
Oh, we do need to approve minutes. I'm sorry. This is our minutes from last.
Last year.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'll just need a motion in a second.
Motion to approve 2022 meeting minutes.
Second.
Okay. Mr. Dunning, how do you vote?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman? I think that was an aye. Mr. Spurgeon?
Aye.
Mr. Ward?
Aye.
Ms. Hairston?
Wouldn't I have to abstain since I wasn't here for that meeting?
Correct.
Or unless you've read the minutes and watched the meeting, so.
Yeah, I read them, but I did not watch the meeting.
Okay, and then Chair Costello?
Yes.
All right, motion passes. Thank you.
All right. Are we now on number 4? I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time with my computer here today.
We're on election of officers.
Okay, election of officers.
We usually do those individually, but it's certainly your preference, Chair.
Yeah, we could do
Bernie,
that.
if, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you don't mind, maybe before we start getting to all of the new business, I could just maybe kind of recap
That'd be excellent.
kind of where we are with the Urban Renewal Authority and why it's constituted the way it is at this point, and what we see going forward this year, and the alternative, what we don't see going forward this year. So if you want me to do that, I'd be glad to do that,
Yes, please do.
particularly for Beth's
Yeah.
notification. So the Urban Renewal Authority, as most, if not all of you know, has been around since I believe, the early 1980s in Englewood, and it originally was constituted to facilitate an urban renewal project in the downtown core area that surrounded Broadway. And it resulted in such projects as the King Super Center and the 2 shopping centers immediately to the west of it, and a lot of the public improvements along the greenway there that goes through the Hamden and Broadway intersection. And so ever since then, the authority has remained in place. When I first started in my position, I should say I'm Brad Power, I'm the Executive Director of the Urban Renewal Authority. When I first started in my position as the Community Development Director about almost 7 years ago, there was a discussion around disbanding the Urban Renewal Authority because there was not an active project. There was an urban renewal plan in place up by the Bates area, which is now essentially developed with the apartment project. The Ironworks project has really kind of filled in that area. And in fact, in the last year or so, I believe the 25-year term of that plan has in fact expired. So the Urban Renewal Authority does not have a designated area at the moment. So I have been in redevelopment, and I've served as executive director for 2 other urban renewal authorities in the state. And one of the things that I discussed with both the board and the city council was the fact that over time, the state and urban renewal has had a lot of legislation around restrictions and tax increment financing and other things. And I consulted with the authority's general counsel, Paul Benedetti, about what would make some sense in terms of the authority's role going forward, absent an active project. And his recommendation was to not disband the authority, because if the city ever changed its mind and the city council directed the authority at some future point to investigate an appropriately blighted area of the city for redevelopment activities, having the authority in place is much easier to stand up and get a project underway versus having to start all over. I think starting all over now in terms of meeting all the intent of the state legislation would probably consume a little over a year just to get to that point. The one thing that would have to change if the authority did locate a project based on a city council direction is we would have to have the council appoint additional commissioners. There are school board representatives that would come on the board and also representatives from the county. So the board would expand. It could in fact expand quite markedly, but that's how the authority would have to reconstitute itself going forward for an actual project, which is a much easier process than eliminating the authority altogether and then starting over from square one. That obviously the reason why we're here tonight is that's still our recommendation as staff is to go forward on that basis. I can talk a little bit about a couple of redevelopment related activities later on in the last part of the agenda, but seeing the landscape of where the economy is and the pace of development and the lack of a readily blightable property that would need help otherwise would not attract investment, that's not on the horizon for this year. So we're proposing to you have a very similar stance in 2023 than as you took in 2022. So with that, I hope that made some type of sense for the returning members and also Ms. Hairston. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
No, I appreciate that. That gives me some insight for sure.
Nancy, can I speak to you a minute?
Sure. No, I'm sorry, Gary, we can't.
Adjust my mute and whatever here, and
Oops, now you're muted. Mr. Ward, you had a question?
Yeah, I guess the question is, absent any projects, I'm having trouble understanding the purpose of the budget. And we might get into this more as we have the budget discussion. So this might not be the appropriate time, but that's kind of what I'm trying to wrap my head around right now as someone who has to worry about the city's budget. Why would we allocate money that we have no place to spend right now?
Okay, I can address that in the budget if it's okay with you, because I do have some comments prepared for that.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, with that, I think you're back to your election, Mr. Chairman.
Well, as it stands right now, Linda is the vice chair. I am the chair. If anybody else is interested in either of these positions, I would open for conversation. If you'd like to nominate somebody else, I would open it for that as well.
Bernie, I'd nominate you again, man.
Thanks.
Could I get a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you.
Should we vote on these individually?
Please.
Okay.
Are there any other nominations before we take the vote? Okay, seeing none, Mr. Dunning, this is voting to reappoint Bernie Costello as chair of the URA.
Got it. Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
aye,
Okay, wonderful. Mr. Spurgeon?
Aye.
Mr. Ward?
Aye.
Ms. Hairston?
Aye.
And Mr. Costello? Chair Costello?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Motion passes. Congratulations.
Thank you. Is Linda here or no? I can't.
No, I'm not seeing her.
Does she need to be here for us to nominate her? No. Okay. I'd like to nominate Linda to continue as vice chair. If there's any other nominations or anybody who'd like to second that.
I'd second that for Linda.
Any other nominations? All right, seeing none, Mr. Dunning,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman, Mr. Spurgeon,
Yeah, yes.
Mr. Ward,
Aye.
Ms. Hairston,
Aye.
and Chair Costello.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Okay. Should we move on to the budget and deal with any questions we have on this?
So I'll provide a few introductory comments and then we can
That'd be great.
turn it over to you for discussion. So the Urban Renewal Authority budget is prepared every year by the Finance Department. And you can see that the revenues part of the budget is approximately $43,000, and that's unchanged from last year. Those of you who've been around for a bit, you'll recognize the fact that the revenues are entirely derived from the principal and interest payments that the Urban Renewal Authority is receiving from the developer of the Broadway Lofts apartment building, which is at the southwest corner of Englewood Parkway and South Broadway. That amortization is continuing on schedule, and that represents 100% of the revenues that are expected for this year, which is just a little over $43,000. In terms of the expenditures, you can see in the middle part of the screen that we've really not had very many, if any, expenditures in the last couple of years. In fact, I don't think we had any last year, other than probably the audit amount that may have been provided to the Finance Department to cover the very simple audit that would be required of the Urban Renewal Authority annually. So for more than a few years, the authority has adopted a line item budget around some very minimal supply type things. There's been a training budget for commissioners that if you wanted to have additional exposure to some expertise relative to learning more about how urban renewal works and the state law, that we've retained that at about $1,500. A lot of that went away during COVID. Colorado Municipal League and Downtown Colorado are the principal providers of that training. And that basically ended for the last 3 years. They're gradually coming back. So if you wanted to retain that line item, we can certainly make you aware of upcoming training opportunities as we receive them throughout the year. There's a line item for legal services. That would be the retention of Mr. Benedetti, who's continued to act as the general counsel of the authority. And then you see the largest line is that other, which is approximately just under $200,000. That's kind of been a placeholder for several years in case the authority was directed by council to initiate any type of urban renewal investigations, let alone an urban renewal project. And so I don't want to steal Commissioner Ward's thunder a little bit, but he and I had initiated a dialogue last week about the extent of that budget, that other expense budget, which is essentially a placeholder figure. I think you might have a couple of alternatives. If you wanted to turn away from that model, we could certainly support that. One would be to essentially have that item, that other expense item, be $31,299, which would exactly match your revenues for the year. The other thing is you could amend this budget as you see fit and adopt what you're most comfortable with. In terms of, I would not suggest removing the audit expense and that type of thing, which I think was around $1,000. But other than that, you are free to make any decisions you want to make in terms of keeping the revenue or keeping that line item and the overall budget approximately the same as it was last year, or match it dollar for dollar for your revenues, or adopt some other budget item or budget amount that you are comfortable with. The last thing I would say is You have fairly substantial cash on hand. Nancy, if you scroll down very quickly, you can see that the authority has a little bit under $800,000 in cash, and then the fund balance is a little over $1 million in terms of the authority's assets. These assets are the Urban Renewal Authorities. The Urban Renewal Authority is a public corporation chartered under state law, so technically this is separate and apart from city revenues and expenditures, but we are tied to the city in terms of the council providing the opportunity for direction of the Urban Renewal Authority's activities in terms of projects. So the one thing I wanted to add in terms of a possibility for the budget, and this would be later on in the year, and I'll talk a little bit more about CityCenter later on. But one of the things that we are cognizant of relative to CityCenter is some of the expenses on the city side relative to some of our consulting and specialized legal services that have been expended so far and will continue to be for a period of time in the future. And whether or not at some point, if it came to it between the community development budget, the Englewood Environmental Foundation, which has been helping fund some of the CityCenter redevelopment investigations, whether or not the Urban Renewal Authority would be interested in participating to some degree financially in those investigations, should the financial need arise. We have things budgeted for now, but if the conditions change later in the year, that's a possibility. We would certainly come back to you and have a discussion around that. And then certainly if you chose to do that, we would be providing regular updates of what's happening relative to the CityCenter's redevelopment. Irrespective of what amount of budget that you adopt this evening, what my pledge has been to you over the course of the years, and it certainly would be for this year as well, is we would make no expenditure in terms of a large item beyond the audit without your review and consideration at a meeting prior to those expenses. So with that, we're available for any questions you may have, and we look forward to your discussion around the budget.
Mr. Ward?
So I'll just begin by stating my preference here. As far as this budget is concerned, I'm fine with all of the line items except for other expenses. And the reason why I'm fine with those is because we're telling people what we intend to do with that money. When we have a deficit budget that's planned that shows a $167,000 deficit, and the largest expenditure, $198,500, is other expenses, which is unspecified, that makes me very uncomfortable. So if I were to have if I were writing this myself, I would just strike the other expenses and say, if the Urban Renewal Authority decides to work on a project or is tasked by council with working on a project, we need to conduct a special meeting, and we can pass a budget amendment at that time in order to facilitate working on that project. The other option is the one that Brad brought up, and this would be a compromise position. Still makes me a little bit uncomfortable, but reducing that other expenditures line so that we still show a budget that's in balance and not spending in deficit would be acceptable, but still less than ideal for me. My goal here is to ensure that if anybody decides to look at this document, they know what they're getting with the money. Why do we plan to spend that money on what? As opposed to just having a slush fund, so to speak, there that we can spend without having any decisions made now when we're planning the budget on how we will spend that money.
Well, I think we've always had trouble with that other expenses in terms of what it might be and what might happen there. So I think it's a valid question to talk about it anyway. And I would personally have no problem with deleting it.
I have a question. Were we to strike the 198.5 and work for our commission did arise, would it be as simple, this is a question for either Brad or Councilman Ward, would it be as simple as you made it seem, Council Member Ward, where we can conduct a special meeting and have a budget line item allocated for the funds needed, or is the process more exhaustive than that?
Well, I can start. First, you wouldn't necessarily have to have a special meeting. We could just call a meeting at your regularly scheduled time, subject to people's availability. And what the Urban Renewal Authority could do would be to amend the budget and essentially take that fund balance and some of that cash that's available and allocate the funding from that amount. It's entirely your decision. It's your action as a board. There'd be no other requirements beyond that.
Yeah.
Chair?
Yeah, I mean, any money that we did spend, that if we did from this budget, correct me if I'm wrong, Brad, but it would come out of our cash at hand, correct?
Correct, although you do have $43,000 that is coming in this year.
Right.
But that's kind of an accumulating fund, obviously, as you're continuing to not have a project or expenses. Those funds are accumulating, and then you have funds that have been in the fund balance for years before then.
Right.
So that's the source of the fund balance.
Right. That I understand that. That does make this slightly different, though, than other parts of the city's budgets. Correct.
I don't know. Maybe Commissioner Ward can answer that a little bit more broadly than I can. I do think it's slightly different in that you're not having to do an even for even, so to speak, because you do have that cash balance. But I don't know if Commissioner Ward wants to add anything else in terms of the city's budget perspective, but that would be my answer.
Yeah, in my mind, the process that I'm proposing is very similar to what we do on council. You know, at the end of each year, around October, we pass the budget for the following year. And that tells us what we intend to do. However, oftentimes mid-year, early in the year, and late in the year, our financial situation has changed. So we will pass supplementals to either cut or add items based on the city's financial position. So the actual amount spent or allocated at the end of the year is often different from what was budgeted at the end of the previous year. My concern with this proposal is that it anticipates deficit spending, and it's not necessary. We've already indicated that we don't have anything specific to spend that money on. So I don't know why we would establish a deficit budget when we don't have a goal for that money right now.
Yeah, I'm personally, I'm fine if we want to amend this, that's fine. If anybody else has any other thoughts or comments on that, I guess my point is that this has been fine for a number of years now. I guess I understand where you're coming from. I'm having a hard time placing it into our situation a little bit, but with what we project coming up, I think it's fine that if we move in that direction.
Would it go to the city's general fund, or would it be earmarked somewhere else?
The Urban Renewal Authority is a separate corporation from the city, and
That's
so
right.
it is the Urban Renewal Authority's money.
Right.
When and if the city council decides to formally dissolve the Urban Renewal Authority, then there would be a discussion around where those funds would be dispersed.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brad.
Just one quick question. Brad, do you remember why the 198.5 was the number initially?
I'm trying to remember that myself. I think that for a long time, there was a fairly large amount in that line item, and it's just kind of carried over the last 3 or 4 years. I don't really specifically remember recommending that amount specifically because I can't recall if we had anything that was close to an investigation or that type of thing. I think it's a remnant, and I think it's the way that the authority has done the budget over the last 4 or 5 years. I think that Commissioner Ward's recommendation is perfectly acceptable to us in terms of that change in the direction, because again, if you did have to investigate or expend any significant funds, one, you have the funds elsewhere, and two, we would obviously return to you for a discussion at your board for the justification for that expense, and then amending the budget at that time.
Mr. Ward?
This is a good time for me to propose an amendment.
Okay, you're making a motion.
Yes, I move to amend the proposed 2023 budget to strike the other expenses line from 198,500 to 0.
Okay, do I have a second?
Do we foresee technical training this year? Should we just strike that out too? Make it even seem better?
I'm fine leaving technical training in because
I'm
we're
asking
actually
others. Yeah.
okay.
Right. I guess we could leave that.
Sorry, quick question. What does that technical training entail usually? Or
So the Colorado Municipal League and Downtown Colorado Incorporated, prior to the pandemic, they would offer at least once, sometimes twice a year, 2 or 3 hour workshop for commissioners of urban renewal authorities and downtown development authorities to essentially go over how their job works, how the state enabling legislation gives them the powers that they have, how the financing mechanisms work through tax increment financing and those types of things. And so we, as we got the opportunities through the normal channels that we have, because we have communication relationships with both of those entities, we would pass that along to the commissioners just in case anybody was interested in doing a little bit deeper dive in terms of how the authorities actually work. As I said earlier, that really essentially stopped for the last now 3 years, but I believe they're slowly coming back. And so that line item, if any of you were interested, if Nancy or I received a communication saying, hey, there's a renewal training coming up in August, we're gonna propagate that to the board. And then if you want to take advantage of those opportunities, you certainly can, and the authority would pick up the tab for that. We're not talking about, you know, hundreds and hundreds of dollars for everyone. It's very affordable. And I'm hopeful that they're more inclined to do them in the metro area. Prior to the pandemic, they were kind of going far afield in the state, like La Junta and places in the West Slope that had a, you know, I think the idea was to spread the wealth around, so to speak, but I think a lot of people had a hard time getting those places. If they start to more robust programs, we'll certainly pass those along to you. And then this will be a mechanism to pay for it.
And personally speak to that. Having attended some of those classes in years past, I thought they were very informative and very applicable. And yet, we all know that when the COVID came along, that really shut a lot of that down. But anyway, they do have some very good training courses out there. But as long as we have the possibility of coming up with the funds, without a whole lot of trouble, I would vote for removing it from the budget as it is in there now.
If I could make a recommendation, I would propose that you leave some type of nominal amount in that, because if somebody wanted to take advantage of a training, if it's $125, I'd hate to have to call a board meeting to authorize $125. Just a thought.
That's true. That's very true.
Yeah, when I questioned it, I assumed there was no training this year only because I have not seen anything listed. So
yes, we have not seen anything yet.
that was my point.
It couldn't change.
So Member Ward has moved. I do not have a second on that amendment. Do I have a second on the amendment?
I'll second it.
Okay. Are you ready to vote on the amendment or would you like more discussion?
Are we voting on just changing it with some money in there or no money?
I'm sorry, Mr. Bowman. The motion is to amend the proposed budget to strike the other expense of $198,500. So we're voting on that amendment, and then if that passes, we'll come back and vote on the amended, to accept the amended budget.
Okay,
Okay,
right.
Chair, are you ready for the vote?
Yes.
Okay, so again, we're voting on the amendment made by Member Ward. So Mr. Dunning,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Spurgeon,
Aye.
Mr. Ward,
Aye.
Ms. Hairston,
Aye.
and Chair Costello.
Aye.
Okay, now if I could have a motion to adopt the 2023 budget as amended.
I move to adopt the 2023 budget as amended.
I'll second.
And the chair seconded, okay. Are you ready to vote or would you like discussion, Chair?
I think we're ready to vote.
Okay. So, Mr. Dunning,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Spurgeon.
Aye.
Mr. Ward,
Aye.
Ms. Hairston,
Aye.
and Chair Costello.
Aye.
All right, budget passes. We do need to, do we also need to adopt the resolution?
Of the budget?
I believe so.
Okay.
So it's Resolution 1, Series 2023.
I move to adopt that resolution.
Second.
Thank you. Would you like the vote, Chair, or discussion?
Yes. That's
Okay. Mr. Dunning,
Aye.
Mr. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Spurgeon.
Aye.
Member Ward,
Aye.
Ms. Hairston,
Aye.
and Chair Costello.
aye.
Thank you. We have a budget.
Thank you all. I think that was a helpful discussion and we endorse the change.
Sorry, my agenda just crashed on me here.
Oh, that's okay. You're down to, I think, Brad's going to talk about the city property.
The property
versus-
conveyance memo, yeah.
Yeah.
So when I was providing the introduction to the meeting, I indicated that the Urban Renewal Authority is around since the 1980s. And one of the things that the Urban Renewal Authority did in the 1980s was acquire a lot of property in downtown Englewood to facilitate redevelopment over the years. And over those years, some of those properties were sold off over time as development happened. And related to some of the recent discussion about the budget, your revenue is tied to that. That project came along based on the sale of both city and EURA property to the developer that resulted in the apartment project. One of the things that came up, I believe in the summer of 21 or late in the summer of 21, was some weed growth in a lot on Broadway that records at that point indicated it was owned by the Renewal Authority. And so I was contacted by my boss, the city manager, and we had a discussion around the maintenance of that lot. And so we kind of took care of that, but that related to the larger question, which was, does in fact the Urban Renewal Authority own any remaining properties or parcels in that area? And so at this meeting last year, I requested your authorization to do some investigation, some property research. And so the combination of Nancy, one of our staff members, and some title companies, we completed that in the middle part of last year to try to get a sense of where things stand relative to what we think, in fact, the Urban Renewal Authority may continue to own out there. One thing that I should say is some of you are probably familiar with, the Urban Renewal Authority does have a parcel that's underneath the shopping center that includes Hobby Lobby. So actually the physical location of the parcel that the URA still owns is literally underneath the daycare that's on the north side of that shopping center. That's really not on the table for discussion because the owner of that shopping center has a right of first refusal to acquire that parcel for $10. So that is really kind of awaiting redevelopment and some type of change in that parcel that's down the road at some point. That's obviously not predictable this evening. However, we did see and did get some results that were, I thought, fairly interesting and a little bit surprising in a couple of cases that the property records indicate that the URA doesn't still fact own what I would call some remnant parcels. There are 2 parcels that are located along Englewood Parkway, either in the sidewalk or actually in the street. So obviously they're in right of way and they're publicly accessible. They're certainly not developable. And then the third one is smack dab in the middle of the Little Dry Creek Greenway. And so these are obviously remnant parcels that for whatever reason weren't accurately conveyed, we believe, to the parties that would be the requisite receivers. So our proposal to you this evening is to provide us the authorization to start a discussion with the Office of the City Attorney to convey these parcels to the City of Englewood. Obviously, that makes the most sense because the City of Englewood owns all of the surrounding parcels that are conveying either the creek, the greenway, or traffic and pedestrians along the sidewalk. So we're all further recommending that you convey this, obviously, for no remuneration to the Renewal Authority based on the principal fact that none of these parcels are developable. They have no real estate value, and it just would make sense to revert those to the city for the city's control into the future. So I just wanted to provide a summary of that follow-up and ask for that direction to go forward.
Mr. Ward?
Is there a process for abandoning or delisting a parcel with the county? Like, for instance, these Englewood Parkway parcels are obviously in the public right of way, but we technically own them. So how does that work? That might be a more appropriate action than delivering them to the city.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. That would be the basis for the next step would be what would be most appropriate, and that would be the discussion with the city attorney, and then have that drive the appropriate process for its transfer. The operative thing here is to transfer it from the Urban Renewal Authority in whatever conveyance that makes sense.
Yeah, I think this makes sense. Brett, are you looking for a motion for us to approve and to give you authorization to move forward with this?
That would be my recommendation. Yes, thank you.
Does anybody else have any other questions or thoughts or comments? I'll make a motion then to direct the properties to be conveyed to the city of Englewood or whatever whatever outcome the city deems appropriate based on the reality of each of these parcels. And without any requirement for monetary compensation by the EURA.
I'll second that, Bernie.
Okay. Should we vote?
Sure. Mr. Dunning?
Aye.
Mr. Bowman?
Aye.
Mr. Spurgeon?
Aye.
Mr. Ward?
Aye.
Excuse me. Ms. Hairston?
Aye.
And Chair Costello?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Okay. And then Brad, it looks like you have a report or at least an update on the city center redevelopment.
I do. I wanted to update the commission this evening on a couple of items. First would be the status of City Center and its impending future. And then I also want to talk a little bit about, because I know the board in the last couple of years as the Downtown Development Authority was starting to be operationalized, kind of where they are with their work as well. So in terms of the City Center area, you can go to the next slide. So you may have read or heard that our development partner withdrew, SKB from Portland, Oregon, withdrew in October. We forged a relationship with SKB through a competitive national bidding process for a development partner about 3 years ago, and we were in discussions with SKB that entire time. COVID had a little bit of a hiccup at the beginning, but we were working through various agreements with them. And then they decided to withdraw from the project in October. And for a couple of reasons they cited to us one was the rapidly increasing, from their perspective, uncertainty in the real estate market. That was really tied to their potential borrowing costs given inflation and construction impacts, and just where they saw at that time, kind of maybe where the national market was headed in terms of a general slowdown in real estate construction and development activity. And then the other thing is they had even though the timeline was perceived as fairly lengthy, they were going to propose a closing on the property and transfer a ground lease on the property by the end of this year now. They perceive that as still risky for them. Their closing was contingent on having every single item in what would have to be getting the silver shovels out completed prior to moving forward. So that included all the entitlements, so all the city approvals and public financing from both the city and the Downtown Development Authority. They saw an increasing amount of risk associated to that in terms of the closer they got, or the clock got to that end of 2023 timeline. So they decided to withdraw. I must say that I've been in this business in terms of redevelopment for 30 years now, and this is not at all unusual for a project that is this large, that is this complex. I did a hotel project in a former community that ultimately succeeded on its third developer through a public-private partnership. I worked on a mall project that had its second developer before it was able to gain traction and actually get constructed. So again, it was disappointing at the time, but it's not entirely unusual for these types of projects to have that type of outcome, at least at the beginning. One of the things that is also a major factor in this property is that a significant part of it, the 24-hour fitness building, the former Office Depot, Harbor Freight, the two stores in front of Walmart, not Walmart itself, they're part of a former parcel that was controlled by the Weingarten Real Estate Company. They defaulted in 2018, and it's gone into a special servicer role, which is a group out of Miami that is charged with both the management of the current real estate, but their real mission is to try to dispose of it for a next user, to try to recover as much of that investment for their clients as possible. So the city center areas is entirely under a ground lease that was prepaid in the early 2000s in order for the city to be able to provide the funding for the Civic Center building and other improvements around that area. So that's another complicating factor in that ground leases are very difficult to develop on anymore, especially if you're talking about certain uses like housing, especially for sale housing, hotels. They all like to control the real estate, and ground leases are very difficult to contend with. So L&R is a major player here. They have not gone away. We're continuing to coordinate very closely with them to make sure that we have the opportunity to present City Center once again nationally as a redevelopment site for the development community. The one thing that L&R could do is they could choose to re-tenant the property, write some new leases that would be subject to that. You know, people in retail have far shorter time frames, so they could sign maybe 10-year leases with 3-5-year extensions, which is pretty typical for national retailers. They could do that, but they would not make as much on the upside for their investors than if we presented this to the development community as a very comprehensive, transit-oriented development, higher density redevelopment project. So we're working toward that end to take another bite at the apple. So we're working with L&R to try to have that outcome, that we share in that outcome, that we actually do a joint marketing effort to the national development community to make sure that they know that there is the potential for a public-private partnership on this site. And one of the things that we're doing at the very beginning here is on February 11th, the City Council, the Downtown Development Authority Board, and a couple of representatives from the Eleanor Partners Group are going to have a visioning workshop on Saturday, February 11th, to kind of reconnect people together and start to have another discussion around what the vision for this property could be. There's very serious constraints that don't create an unlimited vision, but we want to have the opportunity for all the major players that are involved in the project to reconnect and to reestablish some larger term objectives, and hopefully to recommit to the shared idea of presenting this again as a comprehensive redevelopment opportunity versus LNR just selling it off and preventing essentially redevelopment for many, many years to come. So the reason why the DDA board is a part of that group is the DDA has up to $70 million in bonding authority through their tax increment mechanism that's now in place. That was approved by the district's residents and business owners earlier a year ago in November. And so not all of that money, it obviously would be expended in the city center area, but the western part of the Downtown Development Authority's boundaries extend to the city, to and include the city center area. But they have that development capacity, not only in city center, but in the core of downtown and then the east side, which is the wellness district. So that's a little bit about where things stand in terms of what's going on with city center. Again, the idea is to try to reconvene, come back together, reground ourselves in a commitment to move forward in a partnership, and then again to present the opportunity to the national development community for the comprehensive redevelopment of the site rather than a piecemeal and less than permanent option, which would be to just lease what's there and let Eleanor walk away. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions about this.
What's your sense on how patient LNR is with this sort of setback with SKB walking away? I mean, it sounds like they're going to come to the table in February, kind of hear a new vision. You know, if this happens again, Brad, do you think that I'd hate to see it just be parceled off like that, you know?
Yeah, I think that's the question, Logan. That is very perceptive and is probably the primary question right now, which is they've indicated to us that they are interested in moving forward very quickly. And if we discover that we can't move forward, they want to know that equally quickly so that they can go forward with that kind of plan B. But I think that there's still a lot of upside for them to come together with us and to try to have a partnership going forward as we did the last 3 years. They've been around for a while. It's not as if they came on the scene in the last 6 months or so. We've been working with them well over 2 years. And we know them quite well now. But there is that upside for them to see a lot more value for their bondholders in terms of recapturing some of that debt through a redevelopment scenario than versus just leasing it. There's a lot more value in doing that. So I'm hopeful that not patience, but the understanding that there needs to be dialogue, commitment, coming together around some of these things in order to provide the community with the confidence that we're going forward in the right way. That they'll understand that and they'll get on board and we'll be able to proceed.
Who owns the dirt under the Civic Center?
Right now, the parcel is owned by a separate entity from the city known as the Englewood Environmental Foundation. And that was put in place long ago with the original redevelopment of Cinderella City. To do two things. There was some subsurface environmental contamination. And then the old Cinderella City Mall, as you can imagine, a building built in the mid-60s, it was rife with asbestos. So the city created that entity as a kind of an arm's length transaction in terms of liability and around environmental issues. So that entity still exists, but there are active discussions around at the point that makes sense that the city of Englewood would resume the proprietorship of the real estate underneath all of it. It's just a matter of time when that comes together, both in terms of the redevelopment project and those types of factors, but ultimately it will revert to the city, and that EVE corporation will be dissolved. It'll be city ownership. The challenge for the redevelopment would be is how do we come to an agreement with a development partner and give the city the confidence to consider the idea of extinguishing that ground lease, which has 52 years left. It was a 75-year ground lease. If the city door extinguished that lease in exchange for the redevelopment plan that would be negotiated, then the ownership of the lion's share of CityCenter would be in private hands, with the exception of possibility of wherever the city would land in terms of its administrative and other functions that are there now.
That's the only property where I think you mentioned something else that was under a ground lease. Is that all part of the same?
Yes, CityCenter is under. I apologize for not including the handy dandy map that we do with all of these presentations, but the publicly owned part of CityCenter is everything that excludes Walmart. They own their own real estate, and the 2 apartment buildings that are already existing now. Everything else is either that EAF or it's controlled by, at the moment, it's controlled by L&R in terms of the parcels I described earlier. Okay, Nancy, can we go to the DDA? So I just wanted to provide a quick update around the Englewood Downtown Development Authority, because it's kind of a sister organization to the Urban Renewal Authority. EDDA or DDAs in Colorado and URAs in Colorado overlap to some extent. The biggest place that they overlap is in the ability to finance public improvements through the mechanism of tax increment financing, which is capturing the increased value of tax revenue, both property tax and sales tax that is captured by redevelopment over time. Both entities have that ability. The one thing that is a big distinguishing difference is that urban renewal authorities have the ability to acquire properties through eminent domain and dispose of them for redevelopment that way. Downtown development authorities do not. But again, there's a lot of similarities. So I thought I'd just give you a quick overview of kind of where the DDA is right now, because they are very much up and running and doing some interesting work in that area. Just so everybody is a little bit grounded, I kind of alluded to it earlier. The DDA extends kind of in the middle part of the commercial core of the city. So it essentially is from the railroad tracks at the Hamden Light Rail Station east over to Clarkson, including the 2 large hospitals and obviously the historic core of the downtown Broadway area. So it's quite a large area. It has 3 sub areas: the Wellness District, which is basically a couple of blocks east of Broadway over to the east side, the historic core downtown, and then the City Center, which includes the City Center, obviously, and also the 2 shopping centers that are between City Center and the historic Broadway District. So a few things that the DDA is doing is they received a grant for about $150,000 last year from the state. They're doing various improvements in the downtown area. One of the things that I think you'll see this spring that's on the boards is they're going to completely redo the Paseo in the 3400 block on both sides. So that'll have a lot more pedestrian activity and vibrancy to it than it does now, and that's being funded through that. The DDA and the city and the Chamber of Commerce are really closely coordinating on co-sponsoring some of the events that are downtown. So the block party is the biggest one, but the DDA and the Chamber are working together to identify other opportunities. They're partnering with the city to plan improvements to the old Hampton corridor in front of the hospitals, which is a very difficult place to navigate if you're a pedestrian. And that area has very heavy pedestrian activities given the hospital uses. And there's been a fair amount of residential development in that corridor as well. There's some fairly large either condominium or apartment buildings in that area now. So it makes sense to start to get a handle on how that area could be improved with some both traffic calming and also some enhanced pedestrian facilities as well. The DDA is, I believe, very close to completing a downtown parking study and analysis to look at kind of where the current utilization is now. Just getting an accurate count of the amount of public parking downtown, I think was a laudable goal, and just kind of understanding how the parking is utilized now. And then based on the downtown plan that kind of served as the impetus to form the Downtown Development Authority, that plan had some projections in terms of where development could happen in the future. So based on that plan, they're also taking a look at, okay, so where is the future demand possibility in terms of parking? Because again, the DDAs are very much in the parking business in Colorado. They provide a lot of leverage in public funds to enable parking facilities to be helpful to serve private development, because obviously they are a huge expense in terms of facilitating development. If we do some shared and common parking facilities in the downtown, that will leverage the ability for the marketability of the area for additional development on the private side. So they're finishing that up. I don't know how many of you know, or maybe you've been around Englewood for a long time, but the Little Dry Creek corridor, you can see where it is, kind of right behind that Broadway and Hampton area, and then it very quickly goes into a culvert, and that culvert goes all the way over to the railroad tracks just north of the RTD parking lot on the far west side. And so the DDA was interested in taking a look at the feasibility of, at least maybe on the very far eastern side, of taking a look at whether or not it would make sense and be feasible to daylight. In other words, to open it up to maybe make some pedestrian improvements, make it more of an amenity for that part of the DDA area. So they're taking a look at that as well. It goes under those two shopping centers. So they'd have, and the city would have to work with those property owners to make sure that it meets their redevelopment goals, because both of those shopping centers we anticipate being redeveloped in the next 5 or let alone 8 years, if that'd be the longest stretch. So that would be a public-private endeavor as well. The other thing that the DDA is doing is they're doing regular cleaning in the downtown area. They power wash the sidewalks a few times a year and that type of thing to make sure that the area is as inviting as it can be. And the only thing that I would say in terms of wrapping up is the senior staff from the city, the DDA and the chamber, we meet once a month and we coordinate shared activities, ideas things that we can do together to make sure that the lines of communication are open, they're positive. And that's, I think, going extraordinarily well. We just actually had our monthly meeting this afternoon and had a really good dialogue about some of these things and some other things that may be coming down a little bit further down the road. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of maybe of a sister organization that's doing some of their work. And again, I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have about this one. Okay, if not, Mr. Chair, I have exhausted your requisite attention for me this evening, so that's all that we had, and I would be happy to turn it back over to you.
Does anybody else have anything else they'd like to add to this meeting tonight? Not, I'd like to adjourn.
You are adjourned.
Thank you all for the time.
Good to see y'all.
you.
You all.
All right, take care.
Yep.
Bye.